So we were talking earlier today. You were talking about being in Baltimore when you were 10, 11?
11.
11. All right. So let's go back before that, because you were born in New York City,
Yeah,
right?
in the Bronx. No, I was born in Manhattan,
Okay.
but we lived in the Bronx.
Okay.
Okay, I was born in the Lutheran Hospital. Probably doesn't exist today in Manhattan. And we lived in the Bronx at 138 Brown Street. At the corner of Brown and at the corner of 138th Street and Brown Place.
Okay.
It's a corner. We lived in an apartment that was attached to the Lutheran church of which my father was the pastor.
Right. Until you were 4, right?
Until about 4 or 5. I'm not real sure when we moved to Long Beach, Long Island. But
Okay.
but we were at Long Beach, I guess, a couple of years, perhaps. And then at that time is when the thing we call the Long Beach Affair occurred.
So talk about the Long Beach affair. This was in the New York Times, right? But eventually.
Well, I'll back up a little before that. My dad's first church was, he had it built in Jamaica Plains, which is close to where John F. K. Airport is today. And he was there a year or two. Don't remember, of course, but don't know. But the church in the Bronx was a failing Lutheran church, and he went there. They accepted him, and he made it a success in the Bronx.
Okay.
But Dad did not like the social atmosphere there in the Bronx. Crime was rampant. Traffic was more or less horrendous in his view, but he was a country boy, of course, and he enjoyed the outdoors. And when the church at Long Beach became available, it was too good to turn down because we were half a block from the ocean. Seafood. All kinds of stuff. And he had been warned by a knowledgeable parishioner that it wasn't the thing to do. But since my father is, like all Robinsons, a problem solver, that was not enough to deter him in the face of the physical situation there in Long Beach. And so he took it. But this is in the Depression, and money was tight.
This would have been 32, 31?
Yeah, somewhere in there. The mortgage for the church had been bought by a haberdasher in Manhattan.
The church was bought.
The church building was
The
bought.
building, yeah.
The church building had been originally on Manhattan. It was a big mansion, and it was put on a barge and brought to the location in Long Beach. Must have been quite an operation to do that.
Yeah. Jeez.
So the building itself had quite a history behind it, and the details are hazy in my mind, but a very famous person, I think it was a military general, owned the mansion at first. But anyhow, it ended up in Long Beach, Long Island, and the mortgage was in the hands of a non-member of the congregation, but who had control of the finances. And they weren't able, the congregation was behind paying his salary and behind paying on the mortgage.
Whose salary? Granddad's salary?
Hmm?
Whose salary?
My father's salary.
Okay.
And so my father, who being the type of guy he was, well, he knew how to do this, how to solve the problem. He held a series of concerts on the grounds of the church to entertain people, and they paid for the entertainment. And they made enough money so the congregation could pay my father at least some of his back pay, but they did not pay on the mortgage. So the man that owned the mortgage showed up before Sunday school one Sunday and made a big scene about all of this, and he berated my father, and he said to him, I came here to put you in jail or in the hospital.
Really?
He was also, one of his sidelines was deputy sheriff for the county. So he did not get my father riled up enough to make a big deal until he started berating my mother. It's not in the newspapers, what he called her, but my sister Muriel said that our mother told her that this guy, whose name was Ackerman, by the way, Charles Ackerman, had called my mother a whore.
Ooh.
At the same time that he was taking off his jacket to do evil things to my father's body. So when he called my mother a whore, that was the last straw. So he replied to the physical threat that this man offered, because he'd take his jacket off. He was getting ready to punch my father, but he beat him to the punch, and he bloodied his face real bad. It was reported in the New York Times that he was bloody, but the Pastor Robinson was unmarked. So he foreclosed on the mortgage and gave them a time to get out of the place. And my mother couldn't take the stress, and she left. She threatened to leave.
Mm.
And her parents came there, and we went back to West Virginia, where my mother was from, in Fairmont. And my father decided that he wasn't going to abandon the family, so he followed her later on. The details of that I don't know, but we rejoined in my grandparents' home in Fairmont, West Virginia, until he got settled in a church, the Lutheran Church in Kaiser, West Virginia, in 1934. And at that same time, he started the Mountain Choir Festival in Mountain Lake Park
In Garrett County.
in Garrett County, right next door to Oakland, the county seat. And that venture lasted until 1941, and it grew in amplitude every year. And beginning in the early 30s, the exact year I can't remember, but it was broadcast by the national radio companies on a Sunday. The choir festival was held on a weekend, a Saturday and Sunday, and each day had 3 concerts, morning, afternoon, and evening. And the object of the choir festival was to improve the performance of church choirs, including Jewish synagogues. And my father had a prehistory in New York City, which gave him access to the entire top-notch musicians in the city.
Right.
Including the foremost composer, whose name is Henry Hoffman. Oh, wait a minute. Henry Huss, the middle name escapes me for the moment. And his wife was Henrietta Hoffman Huss. Henry Holden Huss, that's it. Henry
was married to Henrietta?
Henry was a magnificent pianist, but he was most known for his compositions, particularly church music. And he was considered the dean of American composers. His studio is in Steinway Hall on Manhattan. And my mother and father and the Husses became very close friends, to the point where they became the godparents of my sister Muriel. So
Muriel was a year younger than you, is that right?
Muriel was 2 years younger.
Okay, 2 years.
So when the choir festival came into existence, he had these top musicians in New York available to him to perform as judges at the choir festival.
Right.
The choir was required to present a recital of their own choosing. And for the Sunday afternoon program, they were to sing a program that was designed by my father. And that's
so all organized by Granddad Robinson. So
everything was done by my father.
Yeah. So after 40 or 41, you moved to Baltimore.
In 40, we moved to Baltimore with to live with the Schmidts. Frank Schmidt and his wife.
Now, did Granddad have a job at that time?
He started selling life insurance. How successful he was, I have no idea.
Okay.
And then we moved back in 41, And in 1941, the choir festival graduated to a version of Chautauqua.
Okay, well, we can talk about the choir festival another time, but I'm really interested in your because you were telling me earlier the story about living at the Schmitz, that you actually had your own place, but you ran into. Did you ever have it? Did your granddad have a house of his own?
No, we lived with the house in the house of the Schmitz.
So you moved from Kaiser directly to their house?
Well, there's an interval that I haven't spoken of.
Okay.
Okay. So we moved in '34 from Long Beach to Oakland, to Kaiser. I'm sorry, to Kaiser, West Virginia,
Right.
and the congregation, along about 35, we'll say, 35, couldn't afford the rent on the parsonage. So we moved back to West Virginia mountains. At what became known and still is known as the Youghiogheny Forest Festival. It was cheek by jowl with United States Route 50 on both sides of the road for a period of perhaps a mile long. And it was like there were cabins built by people of renown in various kinds of enterprises.
Okay.
All right, I'll try to explain those. One of the people there was a man named David Lindsay Watson from Scotland.
Right. I've heard that name.
Okay. David graduated from the University of Edinburgh summa cum laude in chemistry. And when the Manhattan Project came into existence, the head of that project invited him to be a member of the Manhattan Project to make the atomic bomb.
Right. We were talking about this 2 weeks ago. You were telling the waitress.
Yeah. Oppenheimer was the head of the project.
Right.
And but before that project began in I guess the 40s. In 1938, he published a book on philosophy of science, which was entitled "Scientists Are Human."
This is Oppenheimer you're talking about?
Hmm?
Who are you talking about? Watson?
I'm talking about David Watson.
David Watson. All right. But that's not germane to, I want to just track your travels, your movement, granddad's movement with the family across from Virginia or from Fairmont to this.
Well,
so we
went to Fairmont.
Watson loaned you his cabin?
We went to Fairmont to live briefly there. And then he got the church in Kaiser.
Right. So he was in the parsonage at Kaiser. And then they couldn't afford the parsonage anymore.
Yeah.
So Granddad moved to this.
So we moved to Youghiogheny Forest Colony.
Right.
In 1930.
But you those had cabins in them, and
every place was different.
Okay.
It was not a project by a developer.
No, I understand that, but I'm asking, how does Watson play into this? Did he bring you to that? Did he offer Granddad a place to live there, or is that what?
No. We lived in a log cabin cheek by jowl with Route 50, and how the cabin came into existence, I don't know. But it was not more than 15 feet to the highway.
But you don't know who owned the cabin?
No.
Okay.
Eventually burned down, then it was rebuilt in a slightly different location. It was further back from the highway.
Yeah, 15 feet is very close to a highway.
Okay. So in 1937, he accepted a position that came available at Westminster Choir School in Princeton, New Jersey.
Right.
About the same year that Einstein moved there. And we were there for 2 years. And during that period, he became close friends with Roy Harris and Roy's wife, Johanna Harris.
Right.
And they became, Roy became the first composer in the United States to be considered by the European musical community as a genuine American composer of American music.
Mm-hmm.
If you can conceive of such a thing. So he supplanted Henry Huss, as being the head or the chief representative of a composer, serious composer in this country. Roy Harris's wife, Johanna, became well known as the finest female pianist in the country.
Right. We got one of her records a while ago.
Yes.
That
And
I found for you.
the people who knew her, the top people, said she was the equal, if not the superior, to all of the men as well. But in those days, women couldn't arise to that lofty title.
Right. So you left Princeton to go to Baltimore?
No. Left Princeton, came to Oakland,
Okay.
and established our residence in Oakland in a house that had been bought by my father, I think in 1932, for his parents. So we displaced my grandparents, who moved in town,
Okay.
and we occupied that house until we moved to Arthurdale, West Virginia.
And what year was that?
That was 1943.
But somewhere in the middle there, you're living in Baltimore.
Well, in 1940, just that one year, we moved. We were in Baltimore. We obviously came. We left Princeton in '39, went to the house in Oakland,
Mm-hmm.
and then the following year we went to Baltimore for a year, then came back to Oakland.
Okay. Was Granddad just chasing a potential new? Why did Granddad go to Baltimore in particular?
Well, I think in order to get a job that probably
Paid
would
some
pay.
Gotcha.
Okay. To
Right.
sell insurance.
Right.
Anyhow, Frank Schmidt was very willing to take on the burden of putting up with our family as well as his own in Baltimore. But anyway, we came back to Oakland, and a couple of years later, we moved to Arthurdale. And we stayed in Arthurdale 6 years. Now, that's a whole different bunch of stories, isn't it, Arthurdale?
That is a whole bunch of different stories, and that's seeming like the longest time you've spent in any one place
Yeah,
at that point.
yeah, it is. Hadn't thought of it that way, but that's the way it
Yeah,
is.
because yeah.
We're there 6 years.
And you went into the Air Force from you were living in Arthurdale when you joined the Air Force?
No.
1950?
No, we came back to Oakland from Arthurdale in 1949.
Okay.
And
you took over the house again?
Oakland was celebrating its 100th year as a community, its centennial in 1949. And my father composed a history of the town in verse form
Right. The ode to
called the Ballad of
the
Oakland.
Ballad of Oakland, yes. You know what? We skipped over a little bit in Baltimore because you were telling the story on the way to lunch of sleeping on a second floor porch.
Yeah, it was a sleeping porch. That's what it was. In those days, it was common, a sleeping porch. It was, the term sleeping porch was common.
But was it enclosed? Had windows and so forth?
It had curtains,
just curtains.
just curtains.
And you slept there in the wintertime?
Yes. We had lots of covers. Apparently, nobody got frostbitten. But there was two families. The young people in the two families lived on the same sleeping porch.
Oh, so the Schmitz kids were sleeping with you, Robinson
In their
kids,
own beds, of course.
in their beds on the porch.
Yes.
Interesting.
Uh-huh.
Because didn't they have their own?
I don't recall whether any of them, there was 5 of them, I guess. I don't know if any of them had a bedroom inside the house. It could have been that part of their family was inside the house and part was out on the sleeping porch.
Yeah. So I want to add something to the story that I don't think I've ever added in my own head, and that is, so you were living in New York City or on Long Island when Muriel was born? Or you would have been in Manhattan? Because that would have been 31.
I don't think so. I think she was born in New York
That's what I'm saying.
Manhattan.
In Manhattan.
While we
Right.
were
And then Heather was born where?
in Fairmont.
In Fairmont.
Sorry, Kaiser.
Okay, so in Kaiser. In the
Heather
parsonage.
was born in Kaiser. Monica was born in Arthurdale. in 43.
43.
Mhm.
Okay. Right.
So
You went back to Oakland. You did the Ballad of Oakland. You did all of that, and then you joined the Air Force while you were living in Oakland.
in 1950, yes.
Right. Right. And you met Mom in Arthurdale.
Yes, she
Correct.
was a year behind me in high school. We were the
So you-
proverbial high school sweethearts.
Right. And then, so you went to Arthurdale. You were how old when you got to Arthurdale?
I did 14,
Okay.
wouldn't I?
I think so. That was 1930. No, 40,
I was.
44.
I had to take a freshman in high school over again because Oakland had an 11-year system.
So if you were in your first year of high school, then you would have been 14. Yeah.
Yeah. So at the age of 13, I did the first year in high school in Oakland because they had an 11-year system
In Oakland?
in Oakland. All my schoolmates graduated from high school a year before I did.
I see. Interesting.
So I had a tight knit bunch of kids in Oakland in my high school, and I never did sever the social relationships with those people.
Right. So you met Mom when you were 14?
Must have been. Yeah,
Yeah,
so it had to
okay.
be.
Right. So then you joined the Air Force in 1950.
Hmm.
Do you remember what month that was?
September,
In September, okay. Uh,
first week of September, either the 4th or the 5th,
and then you got married in
52.
52.
Hmm.
So I remember Mom telling me that she'd spent time in school in University of Maryland. Is that right?
Now she went to a secretary school in Fairmont.
Oh, was that what it is?
Yeah.
Okay. But it seemed like to me that she talked about living in the suburbs of Washington at one point when you guys were very young.
She went to New York City.
Really?
Yeah. Um, the most famous building in the town outside of Empire State Building, Rockefeller Center. My sister Muriel, and 2 or 3 other young women worked there. I don't know the name of the company, RCA, I guess it was. And they all lived together in a Catholic nunnery, we'll call it, near Harlem.
Really?
Yeah, the nuns made some money by renting rooms there.
I see.
And so her first serious job, her first job was in Kingwood, West Virginia, working for the man who operated the University Extension Service, the agricultural extension.
Okay.
And then she moved to New York, and I don't know how that came about. But of course, there was the connection with Muriel and her connections to New York through the family.
Right.
And it may have been how it happened. But that's all lost in the midst of time.
Well, and she would have been 20 years old at that time? Around that?
I suppose. 12. Let's see, 19. She would have been 19 in 1920.
Okay.
19.
No,
19. What am I?
No, she was
1950. I'm talking about 1950. I went in the Air Force,
Right.
and she probably went up there the following year. I'm guessing.
Because you were 21 when you went in the Air Force.
Yeah.
What did you do between college and the Air Force?
Nothing.
I'm sorry, between high school and the Air Force. Nothing.
Oh no, I went to university.
Oh, you went to, okay.
Okay, and I graduated high school in 47.
Right.
And she graduated in 48. So I went to West Virginia University 47, 48, 49.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
And I majored in art, what's known as the fine arts.
right. Now, when did you get engaged to Grandma, to Mom? I'm saying Grandma for the grandkids that are going to watch this.
Right.
Out of bad habit, but
Right.
to Mom. When did you guys get engaged? Do you remember?
I'm going to guess it was probably 1951, probably when I came home on a leave.
Oh, I see. Right.
Yeah.
And you got married in 52
In Oakland.
in Oakland. Who was the presiding minister?
Father Carney. His first name escapes him right now.
It's all right.
But we had the finest organist in Baltimore, played the organ. What was his name? Oh, and my Uncle Percy sang the use from the balcony in the church in Oakland, and he had a fabulous voice, which I inherited.
So you went to basic training, and your first assignment in the Air Force was to Langley Field?
Langley Field.
And in Langley Field, you and Mom were married by that time, right?
Mm-mm.
No?
I went, went in the Air Force in 15,
Oh, right.
and in the fall of 50, they were desperate for people in the Korean War. So basic training was short, maybe a month, 6 weeks, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So in the fall of 50, I showed up at Langley.
Now, you went to tech school. You had to go to tech school, right?
I'm not at Langley. I'm sorry. Yeah, I went to Keesler Air Force Base in late 50. Spent a year, 12 months at tech school.
Right.
So showed up in Langley in 51.
Right.
After the school was in the fall.
Mm-hmm. And then you got married in 52 because you came back on leave and found what you'd left behind.
Yeah. And we had a big after ceremony reception that was arranged by Mom and Dad. It was outside in the summer.
Right. Outside in the church or in the...
No, the house.
At the house, at Mendeley.
Right, in Mendeley, right. Mm-hmm.
Right. So you and Mom went back to Langley, and you were there for another...
Till 55.
Till 55, so another 3 years. And that's where Mark and John were born. Well, John was born in Oakland, but Mark was born in Langley.
Mark was born at Langley.
Hang on a second. Go ahead, Mark. Mark was born in 53.
Yeah.
In Langley.
At Langley.
Right. And then you were... John was born in Oakland, though.
Yeah, well, the end of my enlistment was coming up, and I didn't know what I was going to do. So, she came to Oakland to live with my parents. Well, I'm making up my mind.
I see. Gotcha.
Then I made it up.
That must have been no stress for Mom at all.
So, I re-enlisted, and then my father-in-law brought Mom back to Hampton, where I'd found, it's a suburb of Hampton, where I'd found a place to live. And he showed up at Hampton in the middle of a hurricane. And the epicenter was in Hampton.
Oh boy, the eye of the hurricane went over Hampton, huh?
So, what's next?
So that was fun. So then you went to England.
Well, it took a while.
Yeah. Well, you had re-enlisted in 53. 54.
54.
54, and that's why John was born in Oakland.
Mhm.
And then you, a year later or so,
Yeah,
you were posted to England.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And then you spent 4 years in England,
hmm
and you have some stories that you can tell about working on airplanes. Because I don't know if anybody realizes how much you did with the airplanes and working on the aircraft in England. Right?
No,
working on the air.
all that's, yeah. And of course, well, let me back up into stay at Langley for a little bit.
Okay.
When I got to Langley, the prevailing airplane, the at base, what we call it, the tenant aircraft was the first strategic jet airplanes that SAC had.
The Strategic Air Command. The Strategic Air Command.
The Strategic Air Command's first I said Strategic Air Command. I'm not sure it existed, but the first strategic bomber that was jet propelled was B-45, I think it was.
Okay.
It was 4 engines, but the engines were Siamese, so you had 2 engines side by side on each of the wings, and it was a straight wing airplane. The nickname of it was Tornado. But I was with the B-26s, Invaders, and our job was to train the crews that went to Korea.
Okay.
All the bomber crews went through Langley.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And the outfits originally were National Guard. Well, they stayed National Guard. I shouldn't put it the other way. And there were 3 separate B-26 squadrons. I was in some of the numbers changed, but the number I remember, one of them, the last number of the squadron was the 498th from Philadelphia. And the radar crew and the electronics crew was young guys that were in the regular Air Force. We all came there together, maybe over a period of a month. We formed because the National Guard only had a skeleton crew. And so they had one radio guy and one radar guy from Philadelphia. So the B-45s had priority for the hangars. So the B-26 didn't have hangars. So they were parked a long way from the hangars out in the open. And the shop was Army tents.
And the shop was electronics.
Radio and radar. And the radar that we had was short range aerial navigation. It was very precise, but it depended upon ground systems to provide the signal, several systems, so that the aircraft receiver was accepting signals from several different directions to pinpoint where the target was. The signals overlapped. Anyhow, it was a
Sort of a triangulation.
primitive system.
Sort of a triangulation method.
Triangulation.
Right.
And of course, we were short of radio people, and the radar guys checked out the radios every day. We were very short on radio
For
people.
operation.
Yeah, just for operation.
Right.
Yeah. And the B-26s was a conglomeration of aircraft that had different configurations, like machine guns in the wings might be 4 machine guns on each wing, or 3, or sometimes the plane had a battery of machine guns in the nose of the airplane.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the airplanes had a tail gunner. It was actually in a turret behind the cockpit. There was no way for the gunner to get into the cockpit. But one of my best friends was gunner on one of these things, Jim Condor.
Okay.
Jim eventually became head of the aviation department for Idaho. He was also very fond of your mother and helped get her over to England when I shipped out.
Really?
So we've kept in touch all these years. There was a lot of things that happened at Langley, but I get back to the B-45s. One day they weren't there. And some months later, they were replaced by British Canberras, who had been built according to U.S. requirements. But they were a British airplane. But they were made
for the U.S.
For the U.S., yeah. I don't know if they were made in the U.S. or not, but they were British design. They were jet engines, and they had a peculiar starting system for the engines. They were shotgun starters. And the first day they cranked them up, all the guys, particularly the old timers, were out interested in what these things were. So one by one, they started the engines, and you'd think they were burning up because black smoke came all over the place. And the old timers headed for the nearby ditch. I kid you not. And us young guys were just awestruck, and pretty soon we figured out what it was. It was a big cartridge of black powder that produced tremendous amount of gas under pressure, and it started the engines with a little auxiliary turbine of some sort.
This was to avoid having basically a GPU, which they use today, a ground power unit that.
Yeah, it was entirely different. The advantage to this is wonderful, because it doesn't make any difference where in the world you are. You have your starting mechanism.
Correct. Yep.
And many years later, we adapted those things to be a plane that was similar to the U-2. They made the wings on them about 3 times longer than the original. They were really long wings. And I saw one of those, I'm jumping ahead, of course, take off from Carsville Air Force Base.
Oh, that must have been a sight.
It traveled about 1,000 feet on the runway, then went straight up. Absolutely straight up. So, back to Langley. I guess we're at Langley. As I say, the B-45s disappeared. Well, there were a few accidents there. The B-26 Invader was a very hot airplane. It had, if you waxed it and took the machine guns out, made it slick, it would outspeed a P-51, the Mustang,
Right.
slightly, over 400 miles an hour. That's fast for a prop-driven airplane.
That is.
And they landed fast. They were hot landers. And us guys used to stand out and watch them take off and land. And none of those were the same, particularly the landing.
No 2 landings were the same.
No 2 landings were the same. And while my mind is working on it, I mentioned a difference in configuration. One of the airplanes had a APS-23 radar set on it. And the radome for that is underneath the airplane.
So ground
Like
clearance
most
is an issue.
And it tends to rotate in the air around that. It made the airplane unstable.
Mm-hmm.
And was never used. We didn't use the radar.
It was just on there.
We used Shoran.
Right.
So one of the incidents, I'll try to remember them all that were in my head, was it was a nighttime operation going on. I was on duty. You know, I was outside the hangar looking towards the airstrip, and a plane was landing, and it touched down, and all of a sudden there was fire everywhere coming from the left wheel well and the tires.
That's not good.
A fitting in the fuel line had come loose on touchdown.
Because they had a hard touchdown.
So they had gasoline caught fire from the exhaust. Not very nice. Another day we came to work, and one of the aircraft was in a peculiar location on the ramp. And we just sitting there. It wasn't lined up with a bunch of airplanes, and we walked up to it, and the props were about 4 inches too short. And the wings drooped. It had landed so hard that it chewed the props. It ruined the airplane. The main spar and the wings were shot.
Wow.
And then on another day, we noticed that at the far end of the field, sitting on a taxiway, was an airplane motionless. It was also sitting flat on the ground. Somebody landed it without putting the landing gear down.
Oh.
And the interesting thing was, the propellers were bent forward.
Yes. Yep. I've seen that.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
another interesting thing happened one day. In those days, these are early in the days of the Air Force, the crew chiefs could taxi an airplane on the airfield. And one day, we saw that one of these B-26s, nose was sitting on the desk of the engineering officer in one of the hangars.
The nose of the aircraft was on a desk
Was
in an aircraft hangar.
was in a hangar. The officer there, yeah. There was two crew chiefs on the plane, and they were troubleshooting the airplane. And they did something they weren't supposed to do. Both of them put their heads down inside the cockpit to see the gauges that they were checking out, and they didn't realize the plane was making a left turn. So, but get to the human element. I went through several NCOICs, non-commissioned officers in charge, and I can't say that I had a judgment about the early ones, but then I got a new one in named Sylvester J. Kubalek. J stands for Joseph. We called him Joe. Now these guys are all World War II vets. Joe was different. He was World War II for sure, but he had also just showed up from Korea, and that makes a difference. Because this is in the early days of the Korean War, and our forces, along with the South Koreans, were trapped in what was known as the Pusan Pusan Peninsula. It was encircled by the enemy, by the North Koreans, and so it was so desperate, our forces were in such desperation that the guys that maintained the airplanes, including the electronics, spent part of the day on the firing line, which meant that some of them didn't come back. And that had a profound influence on Joe. Also, and a year went by, and then in 1954, I re-enlisted, and as I said earlier, most of the guys appeared at Langley much in the same time. So I came to work one day, and I was the only NCO there, aside from Joe. Everybody else's listed was up. So I had all these jobs by myself. And I was airman first class, 3-striper. And Joe was the master sergeant, and he had his desk near the door. And we were, by this time, we're in a hangar, because I said that the
45s had left.
The 45s had left, and the B-26 got the hangars. So I had lots of things to do. What to do about that? So I had that kind of a question, and I'd go to Joe. And Joe wouldn't get up from his chair. And he wouldn't tell me anything. He would ask me a question.
Right.
And I finally figured out those were questions I was supposed to be asking myself. That was my start on learning management.
So we could go on all day, but let's talk about England. You went to England and you had some interesting experiences there.
Mm-hmm.
You bought a Jag Mark 7 and
Yeah, those are sidelights. Okay, well, so I didn't go to England from Langley. There was two people from the squadron that got sent to Louisiana to join the 423rd Refueling Squadron that was scheduled to go to England. And the guy that went with me was Albert Campbell. He was a two-striper, and by this time, I'm a four-striper. And I have to tell you about getting the fourth stripe, staff sergeant. In those days, you had a schedule for promotions. And so the time came around for promotions. And Joe wrote me up recommending me for staff sergeant. And there was a small committee of officers, 3 to be exact, a captain and 2 lieutenants, who sat in judgment. Should I or should I not be recommended for the stripe? And the captain, whom I had limited experience with, but some, was a very vulgar speaking guy, which set the stage, more or less. He was aggressive, shall we say.
okay.
And he looks at these 2 young lieutenants and back at me, and he looks and says, "This is Sergeant Airman Robinson, up for staff sergeant, and he's been recommended by Sylvester J. Kubalek. Do you have any questions?" That was it. I got the promotion automatically because Joe said so. That was the kind of thing he was. He was forthright, knew his job, and had all the officers buffaloed.
So you went to Louisiana?
Joe took no prisoners. What?
You went to Louisiana?
Yes. So by this time, I had been through the ownership of Hillman Minks, brand spanking new, and I traded that in on a used Riley, drop head Riley, and it didn't prove suitable for winter use, and I traded that in on a used 1951 Jaguar Mark 7.
Okay.
I lost track of the trip. Yeah, so Al Campbell went with me in the Jag down to Air Base in Louisiana, and we knew we were going to England.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, we knew we were going to England. This is and you can tell how disorganized the Air Force was by the next comments or two. So we walked into the order room at the 420th Air Refueling Squadron and reported to the first sergeant. And he looked up at us in amazement. We don't need you. What are you doing here? Now, mind you, this belongs to the Tactical Air Command. These airplanes are tankers, airborne gas stations. And the Tactical Air Command headquarters was at Langley. We just left Langley. So we pissed our pants and bled a little bit emotionally. And this first sergeant's name is Gibbs. He says, wait a minute. Let me ask some of these guys if they'd rather stay here. That's how we got to England. 2 guys volunteered to stay there in Louisiana.
So let's correct the record a minute. So you went to Louisiana. You did not know you were going to England.
No, I knew.
Or you thought you were going to England.
No, we knew we were going to England.
But you weren't officially because he didn't need you in England.
We had orders to go to England.
So the Air Force had made were sending too many people.
No,
according
they
to
didn't know what
sergeant.
they were doing. They didn't have. It was a matter of communication. In other words,
Right.
don't ask. No one ever explained to me why they went to SAC and said, send us two radar guys down to Louisiana to go. No. Air Force was totally disorganized. Let's put it this way.
That was still a very young service. I mean,
Yeah, they were trying to break away from the Army in fact as well as by designation.
right.
1947, the Air Force came into existence. Okay, so here it is, just a few years later, and communication obviously was left something to be desired. So now the units got airplanes. They have to fly over there,
Right.
but they don't have room on those airplanes for all the men.
Right.
So we went by ship from Queens.
So how did you get to Queens? Did you take?
We drove to
You
we
to
drove.
Queens, put the car on the ship with you.
No, let's see. How did we do that? Yeah, I drove to Queens and put the car in
In a container.
in a place to have it shipped by ship.
Right.
It came later.
Okay. So did you pick up?
No, wait a
Mom
minute.
anyway?
Wait a minute. No. I think your mother did that. But anyhow,
Oh, Mom shipped the car.
yeah, I think so. I think she did that, but I'm not absolutely certain on this. But anyhow, okay.
But
So
she went by ship to.
so
England?
Mom
went to England by ship
later on.
later on. Okay.
So I think she had the car, but I'm not sure. Yeah, I think that. Anyhow, so we had a waiting period at the dock.
In Queens,
The ship isn't there,
you got to Queens and the ship isn't there.
so we had to stay in barracks. And I have relatives in Westchester County, so I went up and visited. Well, we were supposed to have roll call every day, so I didn't show up for roll call 1 or 2 days. So Sergeant Gibbs, the first sergeant, got a hold of me and says, hey, you weren't here for roll call. I guess not. And I told him where I'd been. He says, well, you didn't let me know, and I gotta punish you. That's what he said. I gotta punish you. said, "You're going to be sergeant of the arms on the ship." Oh, shit. I thought I was supposed to be punished. But what that did, it gave me free range of the whole ship. I could go anywhere I wanted on the ship. Everybody else is in the hold. Oh, Gibbs was something else. So we got to England.
So what was that? A 2-week trip or a 1-week trip on the ship?
It was less than a week.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, 5 days maybe. And we landed at the usual place, the Southampton.
Right.
And I remember it was in the afternoon, the sun was shining, and I'd never seen grass that green before. It was gorgeous. And we got 100 guys more. So we're met by this big string of buses. And they give us the opportunity to exchange our money for the British pound. This is a whole new experience. So now we have pounds, not dollars, in our pockets. And it's all paper money. Mind you, get your mind geared up here now. You got over 100 guys and a whole string of buses, and we're going to have to stop to get something to eat.
Right.
And it's late afternoon when you get on the buses, and pretty soon it's evening. It's turning dark. So we stopped at a village. This is not a town. It's a village. At a place where we could get something to eat, or at least some tea.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say tea, Mom and I were tea drinkers, and I was looking forward to this. But before we could get tea, we had to pay for it. All of us had to pay. And there wasn't that much money in the village. So the helpers in the pubs or wherever we stopped, they were running up and down the streets making change.
That's hilarious.
And then I asked for a cup of tea, and it comes out ready-made with milk in it and tea leaves.
Of course.
I didn't know that was of course. And I was horrified. Yeah. So eventually we wound up at RAF Station Sculthorpe in Norfolk County, England. And everything was different. Of course, we got there in the middle of the night. And the barracks were World War II barracks, and they were worn out.
Only 10 years old, maybe 15. But they're wood, right?
Well, the facilities weren't up to American standards, let's put it that way. And our shop was a Quonset hut. If we had a shop, it was a Quonset hut. And they didn't have hangars for big KB-29s.
Out in the air.
So they were on hard stands.
Mm-hmm.
This is World War II airplane, airstrip. The Brits had hundreds of airstrips.
Right.
And we're out in the country. And the nearest sizable town or city was Norwich, the county seat. But there were villages all over the place. So Mom isn't here yet, Mark and John. So they came over by air in Scotland, at Ayr.
They flew to
Ayre.
Scotland from where? From New York?
I guess. That I don't remember. Now,
Well, that would make sense. She would have shipped the car from New York.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. And leave from LaGuardia.
The air crew, they flew the airplanes over, had to stop. They were scheduled to stop in Iceland. All these planes now, they're problems. They're flying problems. You know there's going to be something wrong with them.
Mm-hmm.
And so they all landed at Reykjavik in Iceland. And they were there at least 2 weeks fixing these airplanes.
Boy.
At least.
2 weeks fixing the airplanes. And all the families.
One of the worst engines ever made was on those airplanes.
I don't remember Mom telling me this story. She had to stay 2 weeks.
Well, she didn't know anything about,
She was in Reykjavik for 2 weeks?
No. She wasn't on the airplanes. She went by civilian air.
Oh, you're talking about flying the planes that belong to the unit.
Talking about the unit airplanes.
They flew from Louisiana?
The only people that went on those airplanes were the air crews.
Okay. No, you got me a little confused because
Me
I
too.
thought you said that you... All right.
So
let's reset that.
We talked to some of them when they got over there, and the only thing I remember about the culture was that if you got a woman pregnant, you were going to marry her.
Yeah.
That's all I remember. So apparently they were dating, and they had been told, don't get them pregnant. So she landed in Ayr, and of course I had to get, my problem was getting from Sculthorpe to Scotland. There's only one way to do that.
You didn't have a car at the time.
No, I didn't have a car.
So you had to take a train.
Oh, I gotta get the interval between me getting there and she getting there. Now, we got a whole squadron of people.
Right.
We need places to be. The base had base housing, but it was a small amount. Only the senior NCOs got. So there was all the rest of us. And some of them were senior. They were really short of base housing. So one of the guys had been to England before and knew the ropes. He had brought a car with him, so to speak, or was there before he got there.
Right.
So we had transportation. We'd hold 6 people. So we're going around the countryside without knowing what we were doing, except where is a place we can rent. Well, we made a stop to ask for directions. This is part and parcel of knowing something about the countryside. And there was an elderly lady close by as we stopped the car, and we said to her, "Where is the village such and such?" We knew somewhere around there. And she stopped dead in her tracks and thought about it, and she says, "I think it's over that road there, a couple miles away." She says, "I've never been there." That was the first shock, but we ended up with a place to stay, and where I found was in the village of Elsing in Norfolk County, about 20-some miles from the base.
That's a long way in those days.
Yes, it was.
Especially with those roads. And you were shocked because you were surprised this woman had never been out of her own village.
Yeah.
Yeah. Here she is, an older woman and never been out of her own village.
Actually, it's common throughout the world.
Yes, it is.
As we know. So I found this place in Elsing, and next door to it was another place. So one of my buddies was the head of personnel for the squadron. Very important person to know.
Mm-hmm.
And he was looking for a place. He didn't have any kids, but we had the two. And these houses were 100 feet apart, we'll say, in the village. And for some reason, I guess since the small house was cheaper, I took the small house and he took the bigger one. Well, I should have been the other way around because we had kids. But there was room, but Jerry Hahn and his wife were rattling around in this other house, and we shared the same well. It was electrically pumped. And we were about half a mile, I guess, from the village of Elsing. But we were living in a typical British village. And there was one other GI in the village, Captain or Major Broom. And we got to know each other, and we established a system where Broom would drive one day and I'd drive the other. Jerry did not have a vehicle.
How long did it take you to get the car? How long were you in England before you got the Jag?
It was a few weeks.
It's not too bad. How long before?
Let's see. It must have been after Mom got there. Yeah, it was that we got the car.
Yeah, because
this is very hazy, but I had to go back. I had to go down to Southampton to get it.
Mm-hmm.
And on the way back is when the head gasket showed up being leaky.
So your first major job as an auto mechanic.
Yeah.
How long were you in England before Mom got there? How long was that?
It must have been at least a month.
Okay. And she was pregnant with me when she flew over, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you went to England. What month did you go to England in 55? Do you recall?
I'd say it's probably around September.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Maybe it's earlier than that, but
not much.
No, I think they try to arrange, with school closings, openings, and yeah.
Right.
Boy, there's a lot of stuff I've forgotten. But where were we?
Well, we were in Elsie. You found the house on your own.
Oh yeah.
And then
I had to go up to Scotland.
And you had to go to Scotland.
Yeah. To get there, you got to go to London.
Right, because all roads lead to London.
Everything centers on London. And I didn't know where she was going to be. I didn't know until at the last moment. Then I got on a train and went up to Ayr. And I guess we stayed in the hotel up there overnight, and then we got on a very famous train coming back, Scotland. Anyhow, it was supposedly a cracked train. Go back to London and then pick up a train. At that time, you could take a train all the way into the nearby town of East Durham.
Oh, right.
Good one. They had a train station there. They don't have one there anymore. We won't talk about that. So I kind of cased the place a little bit, and it was a short walk from the train station to a grocery store. So I had everything set up at the house that I rented, except we didn't have fresh milk and veggies, that sort of thing.
Right.
So went into this grocery store. Well, I thought it was a grocery store. They had everything except they didn't have milk and they didn't have meat. It's all separate stores that do that. But the joy of it was we were served by a clerk. That sort of thing had disappeared in America by that time. But that's the way it was in those days. That's what you did. They listened to you, and they would take it off the shelf, put it in a bag or a box, and towards the end of our little shopping spree in this store, the owner of the place found out that we're Americans, etc., came up to me and said, "How are you getting out to Elsing?" I said, "I guess I'll take a taxi." He pursed his lips. That's all he did. He pursed his lips. Didn't say a word. Well, we're about to go outside and get a taxi. And this owner of the place, his man, ushered us into a Riley sedan, his own, the owner of the place. So we were delivered by the owner of the store to our house. There weren't any taxis in East Durham. So we became one of their best customers for for several years. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Shortly after that, I got down to Southampton, got the car.
All right. We can wrap it up. We'll pick it up
Yeah.
later again.
Yeah.